stone tools before the genus Homo, a geometric pattern carved by Homo erectus, wooden weapons shaped by Neanderthals. What if prehistoric humans were never as primitive as we imagined? These 10 discoveries changed what scientists thought ancient humans could do. The first surprise appeared before our own genus even existed. Number 10. The Lomekwi toolmakers. Technology before Homo. West of Lake Turkana, in a dry and broken landscape, archaeologists found stones that did not belong to any natural pattern around them. Some were large enough to require both hands. Several had been struck again and again. Others had served as anvils. Nearby were thick flakes removed by heavy, deliberate blows. The sediments surrounding them were about 3.3 million years old. That date caused an immediate problem. The artifacts were roughly 700,000 years older than the earliest widely accepted Oldowan tools. They were also older than the earliest fossils confidently placed within the genus Homo. For decades, stone tool manufacture had been treated as one of the behaviors that distinguished our genus from earlier hominins. At Lomekwi, the tools appeared before Homo. They were not elegant. The cores were heavy, the flakes were uneven. The people making them lacked the fine control seen in later tool traditions. But elegance was never the real issue. The question was whether these stones had been shaped intentionally. Rocks can break naturally. Rivers carry them into one another. Falling stone can produce sharp fragments. But natural forces do not usually create repeated impact points, organized flake scars, and groups of hammerstones, anvils, and worked cores in the same archaeological layer. The pattern at Lomekwi showed a sequence of actions. A suitable stone had to be selected. It had to be held or placed against a stable surface. Another stone was raised and brought down with enough force to detach material. When a blow failed, the position could be changed. When a useful edge appeared, it could be used. When it did not, the striking continued. This was not engineering in the modern sense. It did not require a written plan, a technical vocabulary, or an understanding of geology. It did require the toolmaker to connect an action with its result. A blow delivered at one angle changed the stone in one way. A heavier hammer produced a different fracture. A stable anvil allowed more force to be directed into the core. Even a short sequence of purposeful actions represents technical thought. The identity of the makers remains uncertain. Kenyanthropus plateaus lived in the broader region. Other australopiths may also have been present. Without skeletal remains directly associated with the artifacts, assigning the tools to one species would go beyond the evidence. That uncertainty makes the discovery more important. Whoever made the tools may not have belonged to Homo at all. The beginnings of technology may have emerged among creatures whose brains were far smaller than ours, and whose bodies still carried strong adaptations for climbing. The older story suggested a clear sequence. Brains grew larger. The genus Homo appeared. Tools followed. Lomekwi disrupted that order. Technology may not have begun as a sudden invention. It may have grown slowly from behaviors already present in earlier hominins: pounding food, breaking bones, processing plants, or using stones as percussive objects. At first, a sharp flake may have been an accidental result. Then someone noticed that it cut. Accident became repetition. Repetition became method. And method may eventually have become tradition. Lomekwi does not tell us whether the makers taught one another. It does not reveal whether one individual discovered the technique or whether similar actions appeared independently. What it does show is that technical behavior began earlier than expected. Long before cities, agriculture, or even the appearance of our genus, a hominin looked at a stone and recognized not only what it was, but what it might become. Making a tool in a familiar landscape, however, was only one kind of intelligence. Hundreds of thousands of years later, another population left Africa. With small brains, simple technology, and none of the equipment researchers once thought such a journey required. Number 9. The Dmanisi hominins. Small brains, long journeys. Beneath the remains of a medieval settlement in Georgia, archaeologists uncovered human skulls, jawbones, animal remains, and simple stone tools. They were about 1.8 million years old. The site was Dmanisi. Its location immediately changed the significance of the fossils. Dmanisi lies outside Africa, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. The people found there were among the earliest known hominins to enter Eurasia. According to older models, such an expansion should have followed several major developments. The travelers should have possessed larger brains. They should have carried advanced hand axes. Their bodies should have approached the proportions of later humans. Dmanisi showed something else. The individuals had relatively small brains. In some cases, brain size was only slightly greater than that of much earlier hominins. Their tools were mainly simple flakes and cores. They did not carry the Acheulean hand axe tradition that later spread across large parts of Africa and Eurasia. Their anatomy also varied. One skull had a long and powerful face. Another was smaller and more delicate. The differences were so great that researchers debated whether several species might be represented. Yet the fossils came from the same place and from a relatively limited period. Whatever their precise classification, these people had reached the Caucasus. The movement probably did not resemble a planned expedition. No one needed to understand that a continent was being left behind. A group may have followed grazing animals into a neighboring valley. Their descendants moved farther. Across generations, populations occupied new territory, one region at a time. Eventually, people whose ancestors had lived in Africa were surviving thousands of kilometers away. The achievement was not speed. It was adaptability. Dmanisi was different from East Africa. Winters were colder. Seasonal resources changed. Familiar plants disappeared. Predators and prey belonged to different ecological communities. The people had to adjust. Their tools remained simple, but simple tools still worked. A sharp flake could cut meat. A heavy core could break bone. A tool did not need to look sophisticated if the people using it understood where to find water, when animals moved, and how to survive a cold season. Dmanisi, therefore, weakened the idea that migration had to wait for a technological revolution. People moved with the abilities they already possessed. One individual raised a more personal question. An older adult had lost nearly all of the teeth long before death. The jaw had healed, showing that the person survived for a considerable period afterward. How? Soft foods may have been available. Marrow, brain tissue, and certain plants could be eaten without strong chewing. The individual may have adapted independently. There is another possibility. Food may have been shared. Meat may have been cut into smaller pieces. Other members of the group may have accepted the presence of someone who could no longer process the same foods alone. The evidence does not prove care. A healed jaw cannot preserve an act of compassion. Still, survival under those conditions suggests that early human life was not determined only by immediate physical strength. A group that shared resources gained practical advantages. An injured member could recover. An older individual could continue contributing knowledge. Experience with landscapes, predators, and seasonal change did not disappear every time a person became less physically capable. Cooperation may have helped preserve information that no single tool could record. Dmanisi also changes how early migration itself should be understood. Humans did not become fully modern and then leave Africa. They did not wait for large brains, refined weapons, or a complete technological package. They moved before any of those conditions were present. Small-brained people carrying simple stone tools entered unfamiliar climates, encountered new animals, and established themselves beyond Africa. Their achievement was not contained in one spectacular object. It was visible in their persistence. They moved. They adapted. They remained. Yet adaptation was not limited to geography. Back in East Africa, Another population began applying familiar technical principles to a material that behaved very differently from stone. They began shaping bone. Number 8. The Olduvai bone tool makers. Thinking beyond stone. Animal bones are common at Olduvai Gorge. For more than 1 million years, carnivores and hominins carried carcasses across the landscape. They stripped meat, broke limbs, and left fragments scattered behind them. Most of those bones are evidence of food. Some were turned into tools. A collection dating to about 1.5 million years ago shows repeated patterns of deliberate modification. The makers selected thick limb bones from large animals. They struck them in controlled ways, removed flakes, and shaped working edges. These were not pieces of bone picked up, used once and discarded. Several had been altered according to a recognizable technical process. That matters because bone does not behave like stone. Stone often fractures along predictable planes, especially in the hands of an experienced knapper. Bone is fibrous, it splinters, it bends. Fresh bone behaves differently from dry bone. Curved surfaces make each strike harder to control. A person cannot repeat a stone-knapping movement on bone and expect the same result. The material forces the toolmaker to adjust. At Olduvai, early humans appear to have transferred ideas developed through stoneworking into a new technical problem. They chose suitable blanks. They struck particular parts of the bone. They produced edges that may have been useful for cutting, scraping, or heavy processing. The significance is easy to miss. Learning one movement is useful. Understanding why that movement works is more powerful. A fixed sequence may succeed only under familiar conditions. When the material changes, memorized actions can fail. But a toolmaker who understands the practical relationship between force, angle, thickness, and fracture can adapt. That is what the Olduvai bone tools suggest. The makers did not need a scientific theory of materials. Their knowledge was practical and embodied. They knew that some bones worked better than others. They knew where a strike was likely to remove material. They knew which sections could survive repeated blows. The knowledge may have emerged through experiment, observation, or direct teaching. However it was acquired, the result shows that early technology was not limited to whatever sharp stone happened to be available. The makers recognized opportunity in the remains of animals. A limb bone could be waste from a meal. It could also become raw material. That change in perception matters. The landscape was no longer a collection of fixed objects. It was a field of possibilities. Stone, wood, hide, fiber, and bone each offered different advantages. A population capable of experimenting across several materials could respond more effectively when one resource became scarce or when a new task appeared. Most organic technology has disappeared. Wood decays. Fiber vanishes. Hide decomposes. Bone survives only when conditions are favorable. Stone dominates the archaeological record partly because stone lasts, not necessarily because early humans used little else. The Olduvai tools offer a rare look into that missing technical world. The identity of their makers is uncertain. Homo erectus or another early Homo population may have been responsible. The evidence is not strong enough to assign every object to one species. In prehistory, behavior is often easier to identify than identity. At Olduvai, the behavior is clear enough. A population systematically selected animal bone and shaped it through repeated technical actions. The importance does not lie in whether the finished objects look impressive today. It lies in the flexibility required to make them. The toolmakers were not trapped inside one material tradition. They could take an established idea and reconstruct it in something new. That ability would become central to later human technology. Composite tools depend on combining stone, wood, adhesives, and bindings. Clothing requires hide, fiber, and piercing implements. Shelters depend on tension, weight, and structural support. Each of these technologies begins with an understanding that materials can perform different roles inside one system. At Olduvai, the system remained relatively simple. The principle had already appeared. An idea could move from stone into bone. Later, Homo erectus would apply similar flexibility to a material archaeologists once paid little attention to. Shell. Number 7. Homo erectus at Trinil. Shell tools and a geometric mark. In the late 19th century, fossils found at Trinil on the Indonesian island of Java helped introduce Homo erectus to science. The shells recovered with them received far less attention. They remained in a museum collection for generations. Then researchers examined them again. One shell carried a series of straight lines cut into its surface. The lines formed a zigzag. They were far older than the cave paintings and carved objects usually associated with symbolic behavior. The shell came from deposits linked to Homo erectus hundreds of thousands of years ago. The mark raised an obvious question. Had Homo erectus created a deliberate geometric design? Before the engraving could be understood, the other shells told their own story. They belonged to freshwater mussels. Many had a small hole close to the point where the adductor muscle attached to the shell. The placement was precise. Piercing that area could damage the muscle that kept the shell closed. Once the muscle relaxed, the muscle could be opened without smashing it. This was practical knowledge of anatomy. Homo erectus did not need formal dissection or biological terminology. Experience was enough. A person who tried to break the shell wasted energy and risked damaging the meat. A person who learned where to pierce it could open the shell quickly. If the same method appeared across many specimens, the knowledge may have circulated within the group. The shells were more than food containers. One had been modified into a tool. Its edge was ground to produce a sharp, working surface. Shell offered qualities that stone did not. It could be thin. It could hold an edge. It could be shaped with relatively little effort. Once again, the behavior showed flexibility. Homo erectus found a material in the environment and altered it for use. Then there was the engraved shell. Microscopic studies showed that the zigzag was not a random scratch produced after burial. The grooves had been cut while the shell was still fresh. The tool moved across the surface several times. The lines changed direction in a controlled pattern. The person making them maintained the design across connected strokes. The engraving was intentional. Its meaning is gone. It may have been decorative. It may have marked ownership. It may have carried social meaning. It may have been produced by an individual testing the surface without any symbolic purpose at all. A geometric pattern is not automatically art. It does not prove religion, language, or abstract mathematics. Archaeology must separate what an object demonstrates from what modern observers hope it demonstrates. The shell shows that Homo erectus created a repeated visual pattern. It does not preserve the reason. Even that cautious conclusion is important. Homo erectus was once described largely through endurance, walking ability, and basic stone technology. The trinal material reveals a broader range of behavior. These people collected aquatic resources. They knew how to open shellfish efficiently. They converted shells into tools. At least one individual created a pattern that required sustained control of movement. The discovery also shows how easily prehistoric behavior disappears. Had the shell decayed, the engraving would be gone. Had it not been collected, no one would know it existed. Had researchers studied only the stone tools, the entire shell tradition would have remained invisible. Ancient intelligence often survives in details that are easy to overlook. A small hole, a sharpened edge, several lines visible only under careful light. Together, they show Homo erectus interacting with the environment in ways the old image of a primitive scavenger never allowed. Trinal brings water into the story. Homo erectus could exploit rivers and lakes. Elsewhere in Indonesia, however, ancient humans reached land separated by deep sea. There was no exposed route. Somehow, they crossed. Number 6. the Flores hominins. Across the water, Flores is an island. That fact sits at the center of one of the most difficult questions in human prehistory. Even when global sea levels fell, Flores remained separated from the Asian mainland by deep channels. There was no land bridge. Yet stone tools show that hominins were present there more than 1 million years ago. Later fossils at Matamenge reveal a small-bodied population living on the island around 700,000 years ago. Much later, Homo floresiensis continued to survive there. An ancient human lineage had crossed the water. The journey may not have resembled exploration. No one needed to build a vessel for a known destination. A storm may have carried individuals on a mass of floating vegetation. A small group may have crossed a shorter channel using a crude raft. Movement may have happened through several islands rather than in one direct voyage. The evidence cannot distinguish among these possibilities. No boat remains. No paddle has been recovered. No departure point has been identified. What the evidence does show is that hominins reached Flores. Arrival, however, was only the first problem. A single traveler cannot establish a population that lasts for hundreds of thousands of years. There must be enough reproductive continuity. The newcomers have to locate water. They must learn which plants and animals are safe to eat. They must understand where stone can be found and which areas become dangerous during floods or drought. That knowledge has to move between individuals and survive across generations. Flores was an unusual environment. Large monitor lizards crossed the landscape. Stegodons, relatives of elephants, lived there in dwarf forms. Rodents occupied ecological roles different from those on the mainland. Island ecosystems can change quickly. Resources are limited. Populations become isolated. Body size can shift in unexpected directions. The hominins of Flores became small. Homo floresiensis stood a little over 1 meter tall. Its brain was much smaller than that of modern humans. When the first skeleton was announced, some researchers questioned whether it represented a separate species. Could it be a modern human affected by disease? Additional discoveries made that explanation increasingly difficult. The anatomy combined unusual features of the skull, wrist, shoulder, pelvis, and foot. Earlier remains at Matamenge suggested that small body size had existed on the island for a very long time. This was not simply a recent group of unhealthy modern humans. It was an ancient lineage shaped by isolation. The small brain created another expectation. Could such a population maintain tool-making traditions? The artifacts showed that it could. The tools were not elaborate, but they worked. Flakes could cut tissue, process plants, and shape other materials. Cores show repeated strategies of removal. Tool-making continued through long periods of environmental change. Visual complexity is not the same as effectiveness. A simple flake can be the best available solution. If a tool performs the required task reliably, making it more elaborate may offer no advantage. The survival of the Flores populations suggests a body of local knowledge that no fossil can display directly. They knew where to move. They knew what to eat. They maintained access to stone. They endured isolation across enormous spans of time. Whether they crossed the sea deliberately remains unresolved. But the older assumption that open water created an absolute boundary for early humans cannot survive. At least one population moved beyond it. That has implications beyond Flores. Other islands in Southeast Asia contain evidence of ancient hominin presence. The region may preserve a history of movement more complex than any single crossing. The sea did not always stop people. Sometimes it redirected them. Sometimes it isolated them. Sometimes it carried a lineage into an evolutionary experiment found nowhere else. Flores demonstrates that survival cannot be reduced to brain size. It depends on how well behavior fits a particular place. Even island isolation, however, was not the most physically demanding environment occupied by an extinct human lineage. High on the Tibetan plateau, Denisovans lived in cold, dry air where every breath carried less oxygen. Number 5. The Denisovans of the Tibetan Plateau. Life in thin air. For years, Denisovans were known from almost nothing. A small finger bone fragment from Denisova Cave in Siberia. Several teeth. A few pieces too incomplete to show what the entire population looked like. DNA transformed those remains. Genetic analysis revealed a lineage distinct from both Neanderthals and modern humans. Denisovans had also interbred with the ancestors of some living populations, leaving traces of their DNA across Asia and Oceania. Genetics showed that they existed. It did not show how they lived. Then researchers turned to a jaw from the Tibetan plateau. The Shahe mandible had been found in Baishia Karst Cave, more than 3,000 meters above sea level. Ancient proteins identified it as Denisovan. It was at least 160,000 years old. The result was difficult to ignore. Denisovans had occupied the plateau long before modern humans were known to have established a permanent presence there. The environment was severe. Temperatures were low. Vegetation changed with the seasons. The air contained less oxygen than at sea level. Movement required more effort. Pregnancy, childhood development, and recovery from illness all became harder. Survival demanded adjustment. Later work at the cave revealed more. Sediments contained genetic traces. Animal bones showed cut marks and impact damage. A rib fragment was identified as Denisovan. The occupants had processed a wide range of animals. They removed meat. They broke bones for marrow. They may have used hides for clothing or shelter. Some bones appear to have been modified as tools. This was not a population dependent on one fortunate resource. The evidence points to flexible exploitation. Every carcass provided several forms of value. Meat supplied calories. Marrow offered dense energy. Hide could protect against cold. Bone could become a working material. The Denisovans learned how to use the whole package. Life at altitude also required planning across seasons. An animal present in summer might disappear in winter. Fuel had to be collected. Shelter had to be maintained. Food may have needed to be shared when hunting failed. Archaeology rarely preserves these daily decisions. Continued occupation shows that enough of them were made successfully. Genetics adds another part of the story. Some modern Tibetan populations carry a form of the EPIS1 gene associated with high-altitude adaptation. That variant appears to have entered the ancestors of modern humans through interbreeding with Denisovan-related people. This does not mean Denisovans alone solved every challenge of the plateau. Culture, physiology, and later natural selection all played roles. It does mean that part of their adaptations survived after they disappeared as a distinct population. Their legacy remains in living people. The Denisovan story crosses several boundaries. It connects archaeology with genetics. It joins extinct humans to modern populations. It turns a lineage once known mainly from laboratory data into people with real ecological knowledge. They hunted. They processed animals. They occupied caves. They lived in thin air. They survived in one of the hardest environments entered by ancient humans. The discovery also widens the meaning of intelligence. A shaped artifact is easy to place in a museum. Knowledge of a landscape is harder to display. Knowing when animals migrate leaves no object. Recognizing changes in weather leaves no fossil. Teaching a child where to find fuel creates no archaeological layer. Yet, those forms of knowledge can decide whether a population survives. Denisovan capability did not exist in one tool. It existed across a system. Bodies adapted over generations. Individuals learned the environment. Groups shared resources. Technical choices changed with the seasons. Together, those elements allowed human life to persist where earlier models did not expect it. The next discovery leads away from survival and towards something more difficult to interpret. At Herto in Ethiopia, early Homo sapiens altered the bodies of the dead. The marks were deliberate. Their meaning remains uncertain. Number 4. The Herto Homo sapiens. The treatment of the dead. At Herto in Ethiopia, archaeologists uncovered human skulls among stone tools and animal remains dating to about 160,000 years ago. The fossils belonged to early Homo sapiens. Their anatomy was close to ours, although not identical. The most unusual evidence appeared on the surfaces of the bones. Some skulls carried cut marks. Others showed areas that had been smoothed or polished after death. One child's skull appeared to have been handled and modified repeatedly. These were not injuries received during life. The marks were made after death, after soft tissue had begun to disappear or had been deliberately removed. Why would the living alter human remains? One explanation is practical processing. Animal bones often carry cut marks where muscle was removed. Human bones can show similar treatment in cases of cannibalism, defleshing, or preparation for later burial. The Herto skulls do not fit comfortably into one category. Some areas appear more carefully worked than ordinary butchery would require. Edges were smoothed. Surfaces were modified. The treatment may have continued after flesh removal was complete. That suggests the remains kept some importance after death. Importance does not automatically mean religion. The people at Herto may have associated the skull with the identity of the dead. They may have kept it as a memory object. They may have moved it before final deposition. They may have taken part in a social practice that has no modern equivalent. The treatment may also have served a purpose unrelated to belief in an afterlife. Archaeology preserves actions more clearly than intentions. A cut can be examined. A polished surface can be measured. The meaning behind it usually disappears. The cautious conclusion is that some bodies at Herto were treated deliberately and differently from ordinary animal remains. That alone matters. A dead body creates practical problems. It decays. It attracts scavengers. It may create risk. Many animals respond to death, but humans often turn death into a social event. The body becomes connected with memory, identity, territory, or group history. The Herto evidence may represent an early form of that change. Mortuary behavior does not need to begin with formal graves, monuments, or cemeteries. Its earliest forms may be almost invisible. A body is moved. A skull is cleaned. Bones are revisited. One individual is treated differently from another. Only fragments of the process remain. The people at Herto were also experienced toolmakers and hunters. Animal bones show butchery. Stone artifacts reveal established technical traditions. The treatment of the dead took place within communities already managing food, land, and relationships. It was not separate from ordinary life. That makes the discovery more than a strange detail. It suggests that early Homo sapiens were organizing experience across time. The dead belong to the past, but their remains continue to occupy the present. Handling those remains may have allowed the living to preserve a connection that death had interrupted. There are still firm limits. The evidence does not prove belief in spirits. It does not prove worship. It does not reveal a funeral ceremony. Modern assumptions should not be placed onto people separated from us by such a vast distance. What survives is a pattern of deliberate treatment. A body was no longer only a biological object. It had become something that required a response. That may reflect a deeper form of social awareness. Social complexity, however, did not exist only within one community or between the living and the dead. At Olorgesailie in Kenya, materials began moving across surprisingly long distances. And where materials moved, information may have moved with them. Number 3. The Olorgesailie populations. The first long-distance networks. Obsidian is volcanic glass. When fractured correctly, it produces an edge sharper than most natural stone. It is useful, visually distinctive, and chemically traceable. Each geological source has its own composition. By examining an artifact, researchers can often determine where the raw material formed. At Olorgesailie in southern Kenya, that allowed archaeologists to reconstruct movement. Obsidian tools found at the site had been made from material originating far away. Some had traveled across tens of kilometers. Other pieces may have moved farther. The evidence dates to more than 300,000 years ago, during a period of technological and environmental change. Earlier occupations in the region were associated with large Acheulean hand axes. These tools were durable. They could be resharpened, carried, and reused. They remained successful for more than 1,000,000 years. Then the pattern changed. Middle Stone Age toolmakers produced smaller and more specialized points and flakes. They used different raw materials. Pigments appeared. Obsidian entered sites from distant sources. This was not simply a change in tool shape. It reflected a different organization of survival. Distant stone can reach a site in several ways. Individuals may travel directly to the source. A population may move seasonally through a wide territory. Neighboring groups may meet and exchange material. The obsidian may pass through several communities before arriving at its final location. Calling this trade can be misleading. Trade suggests markets, fixed values, and formal transactions. None of those systems is required. A piece of obsidian could be given during a visit. It could strengthen a relationship. It could move with a person joining another group. It might accompany shared hunting, access to water, or seasonal gathering. Whatever the route, the stone shows that human activity extended beyond one immediate local area. That mattered because the Olorgesailie environment was unstable. Lakes expanded and disappeared. Volcanic activity changed the landscape. Grasslands and wooded areas shifted. Animal communities changed. A strategy that worked for one generation might fail for the next. Under unstable conditions, social connections become a form of security. One group may know where water remains during drought. Another may know where animals pass during a particular season. A third may control access to good stone. Information can move even when resources cannot. A population connected to several groups has more options than a population living alone. This may explain why long-distance material movement appeared beside technological flexibility. Smaller tools required different planning. Points could be attached to shafts. Prepared pieces could be carried and replaced when damaged. Different raw materials could be chosen for different tasks. Pigments add another layer. Ochre may have been used in hide processing, adhesive production, body decoration, or marking objects. Its presence does not automatically prove symbolism. It does show that people collected and transported materials for qualities beyond simple cutting. The combined evidence points toward broader decision-making. Toolmakers selected stone based on performance. They maintained access to distant sources. They adjusted technology as the environment changed. They may have maintained relationships beyond immediate family groups. The intelligence involved was not confined to one brain. It existed between people. Knowledge was distributed. No individual needed to know every water source, animal route, and stone outcrop if information could move through a network. That principle became one of the foundations of human success. A group stores more knowledge than one individual. A network of groups stores more than one group. Olorgesailie may preserve an early stage in the development of that system. The archaeological record cannot preserve conversations. It cannot reveal alliances or personal trust. It cannot show how an agreement was made. But the stone moved. The technology changed. Pigments appeared. And all of this happened while the environment became less predictable. The pattern suggests that adaptability was becoming social. The next development required an even deeper form of shared knowledge. In southern Africa, early Homo sapiens heated stone to change its structure, mixed compounds in containers, created ornaments, and maintained techniques that could survive only if they were taught. Number 2. early Homo sapiens of southern Africa, technology that had to be taught. Inside Blombo's cave on the southern coast of Africa, archaeologists found two abalone shells. They were not empty. Inside them were traces of a prepared mixture containing red ochre, crushed bone, charcoal, and other ingredients. Stone and bone tools were found nearby. The arrangement was about 100,000 years old. It did not look like the accidental residue of a single activity. It looked like a small workshop. The person preparing the mixture had to gather several materials. Ochre had to be selected and ground. Bone had to be crushed. A liquid or binding substance had to be added. The ingredients had to be combined in useful proportions. The shell served as a container. Whatever the final purpose, the process followed a sequence. The order mattered. If the material was not ground finely enough, if too much liquid was added, or if the ingredients were combined incorrectly, the result changed. A simple flake can be made quickly. A compound mixture depends on planning across several stages. Its method is not obvious from the final product. Someone has to know the recipe. Someone may have to demonstrate it. The Blombo's mixture was not the only evidence of complex material knowledge in southern Africa. At Pinnacle Point, earlier populations used heat to improve silkrete. Silkrete is a hard stone that can be difficult to fracture predictably in its natural condition. Heating alters its internal structure. After controlled exposure to fire, it becomes easier to shape into thin, sharp tools. This is more complicated than placing a rock in a flame. Fuel has to be gathered. The stone must be heated enough to change it, but not so quickly that it fractures uncontrollably. The treated material must then be recognized and worked in the correct way. Heat treatment changes the raw material before the final tool exists. The benefit appears only later. The toolmaker must therefore act for a future result. Other sites preserve evidence of personal ornamentation. Small shells were pierced or selected because they already contained openings. Wear patterns suggest that some were strung together. Several carried pigment. One shell can be collected for many reasons. Repeated use of similarly modified shells suggests display. They may have formed necklaces, bracelets, or decorations attached to clothing. Ornaments communicate. They can indicate identity, affiliation, age, status, or personal history. The message itself has vanished. The possibility of material communication remains. Information no longer had to exist only in speech or gesture. It could be carried on the body. At Sibudu Cave, shaped bone tools add another part of the story. Some were formed into points and implements with repeated designs. Their production required grinding, scraping, and polishing. They did not emerge accidentally when bone broke. They were produced according to learned expectations. Compound adhesives required the same kind of knowledge. A useful adhesive may combine plant gum, ochre, and other ingredients. The mixture must have the right consistency. The surfaces must be prepared. The connection must survive impact. A composite weapon joins several materials, each with a different function. Stone provides a cutting edge. Wood provides reach. Adhesive joins the parts. Fiber may reinforce the connection. The whole object works only when the maker understands how the parts behave together. The Southern African evidence does not come from one community or one moment. It spans several sites and tens of thousands of years. Some behaviors appear, disappear, and later return. This once encouraged the idea of a sudden cultural revolution. Perhaps modern behavior emerged at one point. Perhaps language triggered an abrupt explosion of innovation. The archaeological record now suggests a less orderly history. Culture developed unevenly. A technique could thrive in one region and disappear when a population declined. Networks could expand, then collapse. Knowledge could be lost. Later groups could reinvent similar solutions. Modern human behavior did not arrive as one complete package. It accumulated in pieces. That accumulation depended on teaching. A child may independently discover that a sharp stone cuts. It is much less likely that every child will rediscover the correct heating conditions for silkcrete, the proportions of a compound adhesive, and the social meaning of shell ornaments. These systems have to be learned. Learning may happen through observation. It may involve imitation, correction, or spoken explanation. Archaeology cannot show the method. Cumulative traditions show that knowledge survived beyond the person who first developed it. That is the decisive change. An invention used by one individual disappears with that person. An invention transmitted to others becomes culture. Once stored socially, it can be altered and improved. A mixture gains another ingredient. A point becomes thinner. A heating technique becomes more controlled. Each generation begins with knowledge inherited from the previous one. This is cumulative culture. It allows technology to become more complex than anything one person could invent alone. The early Homo sapiens populations of southern Africa show several parts of that system. They transformed materials before use. They prepared mixtures. They created ornaments. They made standardized tools. They preserved techniques over time. These abilities once seemed to define the boundary between modern humans and every other lineage. If Homo sapiens alone possessed them, the story remained simple. Our species developed culture. Other humans remained limited to instinct and repetition. Then evidence from Europe and Western Asia began to undermine that divide. For generations, Neanderthals had been portrayed as the opposite of modern intelligence. Their weapons, fires, adhesives, injuries, and burials told a different story. Number 1. The Neanderthals. The end of the primitive caveman. In waterlogged sediments at Schöningen in Germany, archaeologists uncovered long wooden weapons. Their preservation was exceptional. Wood usually decays, leaving only stone points behind. At Schöningen, the full shape of the weapon survived. The shafts had been made from carefully selected trees. Their surfaces had been shaped and smoothed. Their weight and balance had been controlled. These were not random branches sharpened at one end. They were engineered hunting weapons. The people connected with the site lived around 200,000 years ago, within the Neanderthal world. The discovery immediately challenged the familiar image of a slow, clumsy caveman surviving through physical strength alone. Woodworking begins before the hunt. The correct tree must be found. The shaft must be cut. Branches and bark must be removed. The wood must be shaped. Its thickness has to balance weight with durability. A badly made spear bends, breaks, or behaves unpredictably. The finished weapon reflects decisions made long before an animal is encountered. The hunt introduces another level of complexity. Large prey can kill a hunter. Approaching closely is dangerous. Driving animals toward a chosen location may require several people to coordinate their positions. Timing matters. Wind direction matters. The behavior of the herd matters. Neanderthal hunting did not follow one universal method. Different groups lived in different environments and pursued different animals. Even so, repeated evidence of large animal exploitation shows that they did not depend only on scavenging. They understood prey. They selected animals. They processed carcasses efficiently. One successful hunt could provide meat, fat, marrow, hide, sinew, and bone. Each material entered a larger technical system. Neanderthal stone tools are often associated with prepared core methods. Before removing the desired flake, the napper shaped the core so that force would travel through it in a predictable way. The final flake was planned before it was struck. This is not the same as breaking stone until something sharp appears. The geometry of the core guides the result. A napper must understand the sequence. Remove too much from one side and the final surface is lost. Strike at the wrong angle and the intended flake fails. The planning may extend across many separate blows. Some flakes became handheld tools. Others were mounted onto wooden shafts. Hafting turns a stone point into a composite object. It also creates a technical problem. Stone and wood do not naturally remain joined during impact. Neanderthals solved this with adhesives. At some sites, they used naturally occurring bitumen. Elsewhere, they produced birch tar. Birch tar is especially important because its production may require heating bark under conditions that limit oxygen. Researchers still debate exactly which methods Neanderthals used and how technically demanding those methods were. The adhesive itself was functional. It joined materials that could not otherwise work together. A hafted tool combines knowledge of stone fracture, wood, glue, and force. Every part must fit. The maker has to imagine the completed object before assembly begins. Fire supported much of this technology. Neanderthals maintained hearths across many regions. Fire produced warmth and light. It changed food. It discouraged predators. It dried materials. It created a center around which social activity could take place. Some evidence suggests that Neanderthals selected manganese-rich minerals that could help fuel ignite at lower temperatures. The minerals may also have been used as pigment, and their purpose may have differed across sites. What matters is that some substances were selected for their specific properties. One type of stone cut better. One kind of wood resisted bending. One mineral affected fire. One adhesive held a point in place. Neanderthals distinguished among materials and used those differences. Their lives were physically demanding. Skeletons often preserve healed fractures, damaged joints, and severe dental wear. Some individuals survived conditions that would have limited movement or hunting ability. One person from Shanidar Cave lived with a withered arm, facial injuries, and other impairments. Survival does not prove continuous nursing. A disabled individual could still gather plants, repair tools, supervise children, or contribute knowledge. But long-term survival within a cooperative hunting societies suggests that physical limitation did not always result in abandonment. Food was probably shared. Tasks could be adjusted. A person's value may have extended beyond immediate strength. This matters because care is often treated as a defining feature of modern humanity. Neanderthal fossils suggest deeper roots. Death provides another difficult set of evidence. Several Neanderthal skeletons were found in positions consistent with deliberate burial. Some bodies appear to have been placed in pits or natural depressions. Several remained relatively complete, reducing the likelihood that carnivores scattered them after death. At Shanidar Cave, one body may have been intentionally deposited. At La Chapelle aux Saints and other sites, researchers have debated whether natural processes or human action better explain the context. The evidence is not equally strong in every case. Claims involving flowers, grave goods, or elaborate ritual remain controversial. Even so, it has become increasingly difficult to explain every case as accidental. At least some Neanderthal groups appear to have treated corpses deliberately. That does not prove belief in an afterlife. It does not demonstrate formal ceremonies. It shows that the dead received attention. Symbolic behavior is more contested. Neanderthals collected pigments. Some shells were transported or modified. Bird feathers or talons may have been removed for reasons unrelated to food. Engraved objects and cave markings have been attributed to Neanderthals in several contexts. Every claim needs separate evaluation. Pigment can be used in hide processing. A claw may have a practical function. A line on a surface may be accidental. Archaeology becomes unreliable when every unusual object is immediately called art. Complete dismissal can be just as misleading. When objects lack an obvious practical purpose, when they are selected for appearance, modified repeatedly, or displayed on the body, symbolic interpretation becomes reasonable. The careful position lies between certainty and denial. Neanderthals probably used at least some objects to communicate identity or meaning. How broad that symbolic world became is still unknown. Genetics delivered the final blow to the old separation between them and us. Neanderthals and modern humans interbred. Many living people outside Africa carry Neanderthal DNA. The encounters were not so rare that every genetic trace disappeared. They became part of the ancestry of later populations. This does not make Neanderthals identical to Homo sapiens. Their bodies differed. Their population sizes differed. Their social networks may have been smaller. Some of their technologies may have changed more slowly. Modern human groups may have exchanged information over wider areas. Those differences could have mattered when climates shifted and populations competed. Difference, however, is not the same as inferiority. Neanderthals were adapted to their own environments. They controlled fire. They planned stone flakes. They worked wood. They used adhesives. They hunted dangerous animals. They survived injury. They treated at least some bodies after death. They may have decorated themselves and marked places. No single artifact creates this picture. Its strength comes from accumulation. Many independent lines of evidence point in the same direction. The primitive caveman was not uncovered by archaeology. He was created by modern expectation. Early reconstructions emphasized bent posture and brutal appearance. Museums displayed Neanderthals as incomplete versions of ourselves. Their extinction was treated as proof of intellectual failure. Extinction does not measure intelligence. Species disappear for many reasons. Climate changes. Habitats fragment. Populations shrink. Diseases spread. Competition changes access to resources. Interbreeding can absorb one population into another without erasing every part of its ancestry. Neanderthals disappeared as a distinct lineage. That fact does not simplify the lives they lived. They stand at number one because they overturn more assumptions than any other group in this documentary. Their archaeological record combines technology, planning, cooperation, ecological knowledge, social tolerance, and possible symbolic behavior. They do not show that Neanderthals were secretly modern humans. They show that modern humanity was never the only possible form of human intelligence. Placed beside the other 9 discoveries, they reveal a much larger pattern. Intelligence was never a single invention. The story began with stones at Lomekwi. A hominin living before the genus Homo learned that controlled impact could transform rock. At Dmanisi, small-brained humans carried simple technology into a new continent and survived conditions their ancestors had never encountered. At Olduvai, toolmakers transferred technical principles from stone into bone. Homo erectus at Trinil exploited shellfish, modified shell into a tool, and created a geometric pattern whose meaning disappeared with its maker. The Flores hominins reached an isolated island and maintained a population there across immense stretches of time. Denisovans adapted to cold, thin air on the Tibetan plateau and left part of that adaptation inside living genomes. At Herto, the dead received deliberate attention. At Olorgesailie, materials and perhaps information moved across long distances. In southern Africa, early Homo sapiens heated stone, prepared compounds, wore ornaments, and transmitted technical knowledge. Neanderthals combined many of these capacities within a different human lineage. Viewed separately, each discovery may appear limited. A stone, a jaw, a shell, a pigment, a spear. Together, they alter the structure of human history. Intelligence did not arrive as one invention. It did not appear on one day. It did not belong to one species. It developed as a mosaic. Technical skill emerged in one population. Ecological flexibility became essential in another. Social networks expanded elsewhere. Symbolic behavior appeared in fragments. Some traditions survived. Others disappeared. Some solutions were probably invented more than once. Evolution is often drawn as a ladder. One creature stands beneath another, each step moving closer to modern humans. The archaeological record resembles a branching landscape. Different populations followed different paths. Some developed solutions that endured for hundreds of thousands of years. Some adapted to islands, others to mountains. Some built wide networks. Some met and interbred. Homo sapiens did not enter an empty world. We entered a world already occupied by other humans with their own knowledge, traditions, and histories. Our species became the only surviving human lineage. We were never the only lineage capable of invention. The phrase "more advanced than expected" therefore reveals as much about modern expectation as it does about prehistory. The people in this documentary were not advanced because they resembled us. They were advanced because they solved the problems of their own time. They selected materials. They anticipated results. They cooperated. They learned. They transmitted knowledge. They altered their behavior when the environment changed. Those are not minor achievements. They are the foundations on which every later human society was built. Stone survives. Bone sometimes survives. Shell, pigment, and teeth can endure for hundreds of thousands of years. Most intelligence leaves no fossil. Language disappears. Stories vanish. Gestures leave no layer in the ground. Knowledge of plants, weather, animals, and relationships may die with the final person who remembers it. Archaeology preserves only the hardest fragments of prehistoric life. If those fragments have already changed so much of what we believed, one question remains. How much human intelligence disappeared without leaving anything behind?